There are silences that weigh more heavily than confessions. There are agreements sealed not with ink, but with the complicity of time. In the shadows of history, where public light has never reached, lies one of the most disturbing secrets of the 20th century, a pact woven between altars and swastikas, between prayers and genocide, between the sacred and the abyss, the Vatican and the Nazis, two seemingly opposing forces bound together by invisible threads of power, survival, and strategic silence. As the world burned in the flames of World War II, corridors of marble and red velvet held conversations that should never have taken place. Documents were drawn up, signatures were affixed, and what was promised in those dark days remains, even today, locked away in the depths of the Vatican's secret archives. This is not a comfortable tale. It's not a story of immaculate heroes or one-dimensional villains. It's the anatomy of an impossible moral agreement, of a choice that attempted to balance faith with politics, institutional preservation with ethical complicity. And the more one unearths, the more one realizes, the price paid for this pact still reverberates, silent and relentless, through the decades. In the years preceding the full rise of the Third Reich, there were already signs. Diplomatic letters exchanged in coded language, discreet meetings between papal envoys and German officials. The Catholic Church faced an existential crossroads: how to survive in a radicalizing Europe, how to protect its faithful, its property, and its influence in the face of totalitarian ideologies that brooked no rivals. The answer came in the form of a document that would seal the fate of millions, the Concordat of 1933. This treaty, signed just months after Hitler came to power, guaranteed the Church autonomy in German territory. In exchange, the Vatican recognized the Nazi regime as legitimate. For many, it was a gambit of survival. For others, it was the first step in a macabre dance that would culminate in silent complicity in the Holocaust. And between these two extremes lies the truth, complex, disturbing, impossible to ignore. But the Concordat was only the beginning. What came after, the escape routes for Nazi officials after the war, the burned documents, the strategic silences, the secret absolutions, reveals a web of collusion that time has tried to erase, but which the Vatican's secret archives still preserve, like scars on parchment. Do you feel that what was forgotten still calls to us? That pacts sealed in the darkness never truly disappear, merely await the moment to be unearthed? If this mystery has touched something within you, stay until the end. There's something you need to hear, something the official story never told, something that institutional silence has protected for generations. But the silence eventually breaks, and when it does, the echo is deafening. The 1930s were a cauldron of ideological tensions. Communism was advancing in the East. Fascism was seducing Italy. And in the heart of Europe, a nation humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles found in a former Austrian corporal the promise of national redemption. Adolf Hitler was not, in the eyes of the world, the monster history would reveal. He was, for many, a charismatic leader, a restorer of order, someone who promised to restore Germany to its lost greatness. The Vatican watched and calculated. The Church has always been an institution with a long memory, capable of thinking in centuries while nations thought in decades. Its alliances were rarely passionate. They were strategic, cold, mathematically designed to ensure its survival through historical storms. And the coming storm was, without a doubt, apocalyptic. In the Vatican's private rooms, cardinals debated. Some saw Nazism as a necessary evil against atheistic communism. Others saw the signs of an unprecedented ideological perversion. But all agreed on one point: the Church needed guarantees. It needed a treaty that would protect its schools, its youth organizations, its clergy. And so, between morning prayers and evening diplomatic meetings, the idea of a pact that would change everything was born. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who would later become Pope Pius XIII, was the chief architect. A man of keen intellect and ruthless diplomacy, he understood that the world was on the brink of an abyss, and his choice was clear: negotiate with the abyss, hoping it would protect the faithful. It was a gamble, a terrible gamble, the consequences of which he could not have fully foreseen. Or could he? Some argue that the Vatican knew, that reports of persecution of Jews, dissidents, and minorities were already circulating in papal corridors even before the war began. that the Concordat was not an act of naivete, but of cruel pragmatism, that the choice was made consciously to preserve the Church, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the horror unfolding outside. And then came the silence that defines generations, the silence that allows the unthinkable. Each layer that reveals itself brings another shadow. Keep watching. The veil has not yet completely lifted. To understand the pact, one must first understand fear. The fear that coursed through Europe's veins in the 1920s and 1930s. The fear of communism, of revolution, of the collapse of the social order that had sustained the continent for centuries. For the Catholic Church, this fear was existential. In Russia, the Bolsheviks had massacred clergy, burned churches, and turned cathedrals into warehouses. State atheism was not an abstract threat. It was a bloody, advancing reality. The Vatican, therefore, saw fascism and Nazism not as ideal allies, but as potential barriers against the Red Tide. Mussolini, in Italy, had signed the Lateran Treaties in 1929, restoring papal sovereignty and granting the Church privileges lost since Italian unification. This seemed like a model worthy of replication. If Italy could coexist with fascism through pragmatic agreements, why not Germany with Nazism? But there were crucial differences. Mussolini, authoritarian though he was, never presented a racially genocidal ideology. Hitler did. Since Mein Kampf, the Führer had made clear his contempt for Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and homosexuals, all considered subhuman in his distorted vision of Aryan purity. And yet, in July 1933, just months after Hitler took office as Chancellor, the Vatican signed the Concordat. The treaty was, in theory, purely administrative. It guaranteed the Church the right to maintain its schools, its associations, and its clergy protected from state interference. In exchange, the German Catholic clergy would be prohibited from participating in partisan politics. It seemed balanced. It seemed prudent. But the signing of a document is always more than ink on paper. It is a recognition, a legitimization, and the world interpreted the Concordat precisely that way. The Vatican recognized the Nazi regime as legitimate. Internally, there was dissent. Some German bishops warned that Hitler was uncontrollable, that his promises were empty, that the persecution had already begun. Reports of violence against Catholic activists, intimidation, and arbitrary arrests reached Rome. But the Vatican's diplomatic machinery was already in motion, and once the wheels of papal politics begin to turn, stopping them requires a will that is not always available. Cardinal Pacelli, the Concordat's chief negotiator, sincerely believed he was saving the Church. He saw the agreement as a shield, not a capitulation. But history would judge this distinction with unforgiving harshness, because the shield, in practice, also functioned as a silencer. By agreeing to keep the clergy out of politics, the Church effectively committed itself to not publicly criticizing the regime. And when the Nuremberg laws were enacted in 1935, codifying racial persecution, when Kristallnacht erupted in 1938, destroying synagogues and lives, when trains began rolling eastward carrying millions to death camps, the Vatican, bound by its own pact, remained silent in a way many considered deafening. Is this judgment fair? This is the question historians have debated for decades. Some argue that the Church internally did much, hiding Jews in convents, issuing false documents, saving thousands through clandestine networks. Others counter that these actions, though heroic, were individual, localized, and never a clear institutional policy. The Pope never publicly uttered the word Jew in condemnation of the Holocaust. That official silence was indeed a choice, and choices have consequences. Each layer that is revealed brings another shadow. Keep watching. The veil has not yet completely lifted. What was written in the internal documents, in the diplomatic correspondence that was never published, in the secret meetings where cardinals debated the unthinkable? The Vatican secret archives hold these answers, and some of them, only recently opened, reveal an even more complex truth. Archives don't lie, but they also rarely tell the full story. They are fragments, pieces of a gigantic puzzle, half of which have been deliberately removed. In 2020, Pope Francis authorized the opening of part of the archives from the pontificate of Pius XII, the Pope who led the Church throughout World War II. Historians rushed to Rome. What they found was simultaneously revealing and frustrating. There were letters, urgent telegrams from German bishops begging for papal intervention in the face of atrocities, detailed reports of mass deportations, desperate pleas from Jewish families asking for help to escape, and the Vatican's responses? Cautious, diplomatic, always concerned about not provoking Hitler, not worsening the situation, not putting Catholics in danger. With each call for public action, the same justification recurred. Silence is strategic. Discretion will save more lives than denunciation. But did it save the world? This question haunts the halls of history. Some documents suggest it did, that discreet Vatican interventions prevented specific deportations, that official neutrality allowed rescue networks to operate more effectively. Other documents reveal missed opportunities, moments when a papal word could have changed the course of events, but that word was never spoken. A particularly disturbing memorandum, dated 1942, describes a meeting between a papal envoy and Nazi officials. The subject: the possibility of the Church mediating a ceasefire between the Allies and Germany. The Nazi condition: that the Vatican remain neutral regarding German internal politics, a transparent euphemism for the Holocaust. The document does not record the final response, but the fact that the conversation took place raises painful questions about the lengths to which papal diplomacy was willing to negotiate. There were also the internal memos, the marginal notes and reports, the red underlines. Pius X, upon receiving news of the extermination camps, wrote in the margin, "Verify before acting." In another document, when asked to publicly denounce the Nazis, he noted, "Prudence is imperative." These words in themselves do not prove complicity, but they reveal a mindset, that of a religious leader paralyzed between moral responsibility and political calculation. And then there were the gaps. Documents that should have been in the archives but weren't. Correspondence mentioned in indexes but whose originals had disappeared. Burned, stolen, reclassified to even more secret levels? No one knows for sure, but the gaps sometimes speak as loudly as the preserved documents. Among the fragments, one letter stands out. Written by a Mother Superior in Berlin, dated October 1943, it describes how her convent hid 17 Jewish families, providing them with false baptismal documents and Catholic IDs. The letter thanks the Vatican for its discreet support, but also asks, why can't we shout from the tops of the bell towers? Why must our charity be secret? The official response never arrived, or if it did, it was destroyed. Comment on what your gut feels. Is it faith, or is it fear? The most profound answers often come from silence. The silence that permeates these archives is not empty. It is charged with choices, with consequences, with lives saved and lives lost. And the question that echoes through the decades remains: did the Church do enough? Could it have done more? And if so, why didn't it? If truth touches the invisible, leave a beacon of light, a silent yet powerful gesture, because history isn't written only in official documents. It's also written in the questions we refuse to forget. The war ended in May 1945. Berlin lay in ruins. Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, collapsed in 12. And as the Allies carved up Europe, as tribunals were established in Nuremberg to judge crimes against humanity, another operation, silent and shadowy, began to unfold. One in which the Vatican would play a controversial and disturbing role. They became known as rat lines, escape routes for Nazi war criminals, secret paths that crisscrossed devastated Europe, leading SS officers, collaborators, and perpetrators of genocide to safe havens in South America, the Middle East, and anywhere that would shield them from the victor's justice. And at the heart of many of these routes, facilitating passports, providing shelter, and offering the shield of religious neutrality, was the Catholic Church. Not the entire Church, it's crucial to clarify. Not an official policy emanating from the Pope, but rather a network of individual clergy, especially in Italy and Austria, who believed they were fulfilling a Christian duty of mercy, or who had their own political motivations for helping. The most notorious among them was Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Teutonic College in Rome, who openly sympathized with Nazism and saw anti-communism as a sacred cause that justified almost any alliance. Hudal issued letters of recommendation. He organized travel documents, He connected fugitives with charitable organizations that, unknowingly or knowingly, facilitated their escape. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, passed through one of these routes. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, did too. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of others, whose names did not achieve international infamy, but whose hands were equally stained with blood. Did the Vatican know? Officially, it denied any involvement. Contemporary documents suggest that papal officials were, at the very least, aware of the activities of Hudal and others. Some historians argue that there was tacit approval, that the Vatican leadership saw these Nazis not as criminals, but as potential allies against Soviet expansion in post-war Europe. The Cold War had already begun even before the ashes of World War II had cooled, and in the brutal logic of realpolitik, yesterday's enemies could become today's resources. But there was also internal resistance. Cardinals were horrified to discover that Catholic clergy were aiding Holocaust perpetrators. Bishops tried to intervene, writing urgent memos urging Rome to investigate and disrupt these networks. Their voices, however, were drowned out by an institutional bureaucracy that prioritized discretion over transparency, diplomacy over justice. In 1947, an internal document circulated among high-ranking Vatican officials. Its contents were alarming. A detailed report on how former Nazi officials were being secretly transported from Europe to Argentina, many with the help of church-linked organizations. The document called for a formal investigation. The response was to shelve it without action. Decades later, when this memo was finally uncovered by researchers, the official explanation was that the Vatican had no jurisdiction over individual clergy. A technically correct but morally evasive explanation. Those who remain here bear the weight of revelation. Which side of the veil would you choose, belief or oblivion? Because this story offers no comfort, it offers no spotless heroes. It offers only the brutal complexity of human choices in impossible times. It offers a glimpse into an institution that, claiming neutrality, has often crossed into the territory of complicity. Subscribe and walk with us. Each new video is a key, and each key unlocks another seal. Because the seals of the Vatican secret archives continue to be broken, slowly, reluctantly revealing truths that challenge comfortable narratives. And with each revelation, the question resurfaces: how to judge an institution that saw itself as saving souls, but in doing so, sometimes protected monsters. There are moments in history when the sacred and the profane not only coexist, but intertwine in ways that defy all moral understanding. The period between 1945 and 1950 was one such moment for the Vatican. Externally, the Church celebrated the end of the war, the defeat of totalitarianism, the triumph, albeit costly, of civilization. Internally, in the hushed corridors of the Roman Curia, a darker dance unfolded. Recently declassified documents reveal meetings that should never have taken place. In 1946, a group of cardinals met in a private room in the Apostolic Palace. There are no official minutes of this meeting, only an oblique reference in a personal letter from one of the participants, discovered decades later among belongings donated to a diocesan archive. The letter mentions the problem of German refugees and the need for discreet solutions to complex humanitarian cases. Complex humanitarian cases. The euphemism was transparent. It referred to fugitive Nazis seeking asylum through ecclesiastical channels. The meeting debated not whether to help them, but how to do so without creating a scandal. The decision, apparently, was to leave the matter to local clerics, keeping the Holy See officially at arm's length. It was a strategy of plausible deniability, a technique that would allow the Vatican to plead ignorance if the operations were exposed. But there was more. Among the documents, a 1948 inventory lists items in special custody held in the Vatican vaults. Among sacred relics and historical artifacts, one entry stands out: German documents, classified origin, access restricted in perpetuity. What were these documents? Why did they come into Vatican custody? Why would access be restricted in perpetuity? These questions remain unanswered. The inventory exists. The documents themselves remain inaccessible. Speculation abounds. Some historians suggest they were records of the Reich itself, brought to Rome by fleeing officials, perhaps as life insurance or bargaining chips. Others theorize they were evidence of deeper collaboration between certain sectors of the Church and the Nazi regime. documents whose revelation would be devastating. A third theory, less sensational but equally disturbing, proposes they were simply files on Catholics persecuted by the regime. But then, why the perpetual secrecy? If you've made it this far, you're already part of this ritual. The simple act of seeing is participating, because by witnessing this story, by not looking away from its darkest aspects, you become part of the collective accountability process that history demands. There is no neutrality in knowledge. To know is to choose a side, the side of truth, however uncomfortable it may be. In 1949, an internal memorandum from the Vatican Secretariat of State discussed the possibility of opening an internal investigation into Bishop Hudal's activities. The memorandum was written by the Deputy Secretary of State, a prelate known for his meticulousness. It listed evidence, intercepted letters, testimonies from legitimate refugees describing encounters with war criminals in ecclesiastical residences, even photographs of former SS officers in civilian clothes attending Mass in Roman churches. The memorandum's final recommendation was clear: investigate and, if confirmed, immediately cease any facilitation of escapes. The cardinal in charge responded 3 weeks later. File, do not proceed. No explanation was provided. The investigation never took place. Hudal continued his activities until his death in 1963, always protected by the Church's mantle. Leave your message in the comments. This is how silence becomes community, because these stories cannot remain isolated, fragmented, hidden in archives accessible only to specialists. They need to be known, debated, and processed collectively. Only then can history cease to be a silent burden and become active learning. Veiled rituals aren't always hidden ceremonies with candles and chants. Sometimes they're simply administrative decisions, archived memos, investigations that never happened. They're the small acts of omission that accumulated create accomplices to historical monstrosities. And recognizing this, not to condemn eternally, but to learn eternally, is the true ritual of transformation that historical knowledge demands. The truth about the Vatican Nazi Pact does not lie in a single explosive document, a definitive confession, a signed piece of paper proving absolute complicity or total innocence. The truth is scattered across thousands of pages, letters, telegrams, memos, marginal notes, each piece telling a fraction of the story, none alone capable of fully convicting or acquitting. What emerges from this fragmented constellation of evidence is something more complex than simplistic judgments allow. The Vatican was neither monolithically complicit nor heroically resilient. It was an institution composed of human beings, each with their own convictions, fears, courage, and flaws. Some within the Church risked everything to save lives. Others facilitated atrocities through their inaction or active complicity. Most existed somewhere on the spectrum between these extremes, doing what they believed was necessary under impossible circumstances. Pius XV, the Pope whose pontificate coincided with the war, remains the most controversial figure. To his supporters, he was a pragmatic diplomat who saved hundreds of thousands of Jews through discreet actions, avoiding public denunciations that could have provoked even worse Nazi reprisals. To his critics, he was a moral coward who prioritized institutional preservation over the prophetic imperative of denouncing absolute evil. The truth likely contains elements of both interpretations. What the Vatican's secret archives reveal, above all, is that the institution was aware. It wasn't ignorance that guided its choices, but calculation. Reports of extermination camps reached the Holy See. Detailed descriptions of massacres were read by high-ranking prelates. The knowledge existed. The question was what to do with that knowledge. And the choice, repeatedly, was silent diplomacy over prophetic denunciation. Did this choice save lives? Yes. Some evidence suggests so. Discreet interventions prevented specific deportations. Clandestine networks operating with the tacit or explicit approval of the Vatican hid thousands of persecuted people. But this same choice also allowed the horror to continue, the extermination machine to operate without clear moral condemnation from the most influential religious authority in the Christian world. Both can be true simultaneously, and it is in this disturbing simultaneity that the true historical lesson lies. After the war, the Vatican faced a choice. It could have opened its archives immediately, made every decision transparent, and subjected itself to historical scrutiny. Instead, it chose prolonged secrecy. Decades passed before researchers could access documents from the period, and even now, with partial openings, vast sections remain sealed. Why? What is still being protected? The reputations of individuals dead for decades, the institutional image of the Church, or are even more disturbing revelations waiting to be uncovered? The journey continues. Subscribe and follow us. Each new episode is a flame lit in the darkness, because the history of the Vatican during the Nazi period isn't just about the past. It's about how institutions deal with power, with moral dilemmas, with the tension between professed ideals and actions taken. It's about accountability and transparency. It's about the difference between diplomacy and complicity, between prudence and cowardice. Write in the comments what silence told you today. Sometimes, that's where the truth manifests itself. Because history doesn't end with archival revelations. It continues in how we process these revelations, in how we allow them to inform our present choices, in how we demand from contemporary institutions, religious, political, social, the transparency and moral courage that were lacking in the past. The pact with Hitler was not an isolated moment of institutional weakness. It was a symptom of something deeper, the perpetual temptation of powerful institutions to prioritize their own survival over absolute principles. This temptation did not disappear in 1945. It persists, in new forms, in different contexts, and only by honestly confronting the past, by not allowing strategic silences to become convenient oblivions, can we hope to do better in the future. The Vatican's secret archives will continue to reveal their secrets slowly, piece by piece. Each revelation raises new questions. Each answer found generates 10 new searches. And in this endless process of historical investigation, something profound happens. The past ceases to be a silent burden and becomes a stern but necessary teacher. A teacher who offers no easy absolutions, but who, if we listen carefully, can still teach us how to avoid repeating humanity's most terrible mistakes. The veil never fully lifts. There always remains something hidden, something protected, something beyond reach. But each thread pulled, each document revealed, each silence questioned, brings us a little closer to the truth. And it is in this asymptotic approach, in this perpetual movement toward a complete understanding we will never fully achieve, that we find not only history but wisdom. The wisdom that institutions, however sacred they proclaim themselves, are composed of fallible humans. The wisdom that silence is sometimes the most resounding form of complicity. The wisdom that the past is never truly buried, only patiently waiting for the moment to resurface and demand accountability.